And so some of the things that I thought we could cover today in kind of an informal conversational way was, what is collective teacher efficacy? Why is it important? What are some of the sources that influence a team's interpretation of their effectiveness? What are some enabling conditions in our environments that help to foster a sense of collective teacher efficacy? And what are some specific leadership practices that principals might take in order to enhance those enabling conditions? I also have a list of the questions that were sent in advance, and I think that some of the, definitely some of the content that I've prepared will address these questions. But I also just want to kind of make sure that this is an informal conversation and that there's lots of opportunities for the participants to participate and for me and David to engage in rich dialogue. So I didn't want to make it too formal. So I'll just start with presenting a few big ideas, and then I will pause my slideshow, and then David and I can engage in a conversation. So I'm going to present a quick little PowerPoint here. And I know once I go into presentation mode, I lose view. But again, I won't spend a lot of time on these slides. Annette already introduced the concept of collective efficacy. It's an idea, it's a belief system, a conviction that our combined efforts make a difference to students. And one of my favorite definitions of collective teacher efficacy comes from Megan Shannon Moran. And she defines it as teachers' beliefs that they make an educational difference to students over and above the educational impact of students, homes, and communities. And it is a very important belief system because we know that when collective efficacy is firmly established, even if schools are otherwise similar demographically, in schools where there is a sense of collective teacher efficacy, there is significantly higher student achievement. And so according to John Hattie's visible learning research, collective teacher efficacy is the #1 factor influencing student achievement. And it is because efficacy results in greater effort and persistence on the part of teachers when faced with difficult challenges. Efficacy beliefs impact how teams think, feel, motivate themselves, and behave. And one more thought before I come back just to the group, because we probably already have lots of ideas that we could discuss. But the notion that why does collective efficacy yield such a high effect size? In the research, what it shows is that not only do teachers put forth greater effort and persistence, but the research also shows that where efficacy is established, teachers are more likely to encourage family involvement. There's research that shows where efficacy is established, teachers are less likely to exclude students from class for problem behavior. There's greater quality interventions for students at risk. There's more positive attitudes toward including students with special education needs. Teachers are more likely to promote high levels of student engagement and design more opportunities for students to engage in mastery learning. We also know there's a relationship between collective efficacy and higher expectations. And most importantly, where efficacy is established, teachers increase students' expectations about what they're capable of accomplishing by convincing kids that they can do well in school. So those are some big ideas. I'll just pause there, David, and just check in with you to see if you have any questions so far or thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. And it is an absolute delight to have you with us and virtually in Scotland today. And I'm going to just put, and hopefully people can see when I put the book up, that this is the book that we've been kind of looking at and referring to. And a lot of what you've said obviously will be within this book. I would highly encourage people to have a look at this and read through this, because in terms of school leadership, there's so much in that book that is so structured, and even protocols about the how. And I think what's really important is what you've picked up there about why it's so important, and probably even more crucial now in the current situation, about that the psychology of that collective efficacy, that belief that that people can achieve despite the challenges that exist currently. It's even more crucial, I suppose. One question I have is around the challenge of remote leadership around that, and I think that was maybe something we might pick up later on, I suppose, Jenni. But that kind of, how does that work remotely, I suppose? Does that bring new challenges to it? But the book itself, I think, is so structured and highlights the research from Bandura about the kind of start of that kind of the efficacy and the impact that can have. But even the stories, the examples about class teachers and that the impact it can have on students about just that and what expectations mean. And I know I'm just rambling now, but it kind of ties into Peter's discussion we had last week about when we talk about high expectations. I suppose part of it is about how we unpick that and explore what does high expectations mean? Because like you'd say that in the book about two different examples of two teachers who believe they both have high expectations, but actually it's quite different. So I suppose, and we might pick that up as we go through, the processes around that, the protocols that are helpful in supporting school leaders. So I think there's probably a lot that we'll pick up, and I know you'll have picked that within your presentation. I don't know if there's any questions in the participants who would like to kind of come in with any questions they have. And I know I've just been talking for the last couple of minutes, but I'm not seeing any questions popping in. It might be that as we go through, Jenni, there'll be more questions that come up potentially. Excellent.
And so you've hit on a lot of ideas. First off, I'd love to see how you have lots of sticky notes and tabs in the book. That's always thrilling as an author to see that your work, you know, like I remember many hours at my desk thinking and engaging myself in in writing that book. I remember missing family engagements over Easter weekend because I was pushing myself to finish it. So, and Paul Fleming popped up in the chat pod that he loved the book. So that means the world to me. I really appreciate that the concepts are resonating with the educators in not only North America, but in other locations in the world as well. You hit on one other thing, lots of things. I'm glad that you had Peter and that you've got Paul coming up next week because we all work very closely together. Obviously, we have similar interests and an agenda really to try to instill in educators a sense of efficacy in our work. And we're all quite good friends, so it was nice to be invited with Peter and Paul. You mentioned Albert Bandura. So Albert Bandura was the person who coined the term and did research not only on collective efficacy, but beginning with self-efficacy and teacher efficacy back in the 1970s. And he, of course, is the educational psychologist at Stanford University. And he has some seminal foundational papers published not only 70s, 80s, 90s, but if people really want to delve into the theory behind it, I would recommend looking up some of Bandura's early studies. You talked about remote learning, and recently I wrote a blog entitled Has COVID-19 placed collective efficacy at risk? And so in our time together, I do want to delve into some of the thoughts around the pandemic and how it might have affected efficacy. And then I've just put a star next to high expectations too, because that's something else you noted that I think will come up in our conversation. And if it doesn't, I've got a note to come back to that. Yeah,
that's great. Can I ask you, Jenni, how did you get involved in this then? There's a real passion from you about this. So how did you kind of find your way into that and want to take that further forward with this fantastic book? How did that happen?
Well, I started my career in education as a classroom teacher, and I was provided a lot of leadership opportunities early in my career. My husband was teaching in the classroom next to me. He was a special education teacher. And when there was a posting for a position at the central office to support new teacher induction, he encouraged me to at least apply. And, you know, I hesitated because I never imagined that I'd leave a classroom, but I had been working in the school, doing a lot of support for teachers around technology integration and other things early in my career. So it seemed like a natural fit. That began my career as working with adults, and I started to notice that when we when we give teachers autonomy and voice and what it was that they needed to learn rather than the professional development being top down, that it was really a game changer. It resulted in change in practice and beliefs and all kinds of good things. And so I started to write about high quality professional learning designs. I had 2 books before the Collective Efficacy book that were both bestsellers with Corwin. And I remember sitting in an audience at a conference when John Hattie announced Collective Teacher Efficacy and his updates to his meta-analysis, his synthesis. And it was Jennifer Abrams. I don't know if people recognize that name. She's a well-known author and speaker as well. She came up to me and said, you know, this is your work. And I didn't really put it together during that conversation. She said, this is your work, what he's talking about. And about a year later, I was sitting at my desk, getting the itch to write again, because for me, writing is my own form of professional learning. When I have to sit down and articulate why and how and reasons behind decisions, it really helps me to gain clarity. And I was remembering Jennifer Abrams' comments, and I started to try to pull my own experiences and really turn to the research around collective efficacy to understand it better. And so I think what I had hoped to do in the book was draw on the research, but pull the practical aspects of that research in to make the research accessible to the readers, but also draw on my own personal experiences. And I think that, you know, the idea around the expectations in the book is one of those examples, and some of the work that I've done in school districts and some of the learning that I've seen teachers do and the impact that I've seen teachers have also was an impetus for me to embark in this world of enhancing efficacy.
Thank you very much. And actually, I can see Paul had put in a question. Paul, I don't know if you'd like to unmute and put your camera on and just introduce yourself and ask the question.
Thanks, David. I would have had my lovely background ready had I known my video was going on. Hi, Jenny. My name is Paul Fleming, and I'm a Senior Regional Advisor in Education Scotland. My substantive post, though, is as an attainment advisor with Education Scotland, and more recently was a head teacher. So I've used your book as a real helpful practical tool working with head teachers in a local authority, you know, who maybe looking at raising attainment and would go into products and even processes such as, you know, I don't know, progression pathways and so on. But actually, if they had work on collective efficacy, it would have made a greater difference and started to do some of that work and started to notice some changes. I'm doing some work at university and was going to do research around academic optimism as a construct. And when I was reading your book, I suppose, about collective efficacy, I saw that almost as academic optimism because you referred to high expectations. But when I look at the construct of academic optimism, it talks about 3 parts of that, and collective efficacy being one of the 3 parts. And I don't know if you know, I know it's a contested, I suppose, construct somewhat, academic optimism, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on what the differences are, you know, in terms of academic optimism having just one part of it, or if it's like yours, if it's all encompassing. I don't know if that makes sense.
What are the other 2 aspects of academic optimism besides collective efficacy?
Trust, culture, trust, faculty trust, and what's it? Academic emphasis. So a real focus. So that by that they mean high expectations that the children and young people, all of them, can achieve. You know, so having those real academic high expectations, but the faculty trust, and that's trust in the parents as well, and working alongside folk. That's the 3 parts of it.
Nice. And I see all of those closely intertwined, of course.
Yeah, very interconnected.
Absolutely. What came to my mind too was the term academic press, and you've probably come across that. And it's a construct for meaning to the degree that teachers are putting the standards or curriculum into place, that, you know, that idea of rigor, you know, and there's a relationship where efficacy is present, that there's higher academic press as well in a school. So that notion of optimism, I think, is interesting because I think that trust is an important aspect of collective efficacy, and I think that those the notion of expectations is also really important. So I think that they're all very closely intertwined. It made me think of another idea when you talked about optimism, it's the notion of collective flow. And of course, we've heard the term flow, and somebody in line could probably pronounce the name of the author, The Psychology of Flow. I should practice it so that it'll roll off my tongue like it does for some others. But recently, I've been reading studies around collective flow, and I found those interesting, like the concept of optimism, because in relation to collective efficacy, there are 4 sources that influence a team's interpretation of their effectiveness. One of those sources are affective states. And those are the feelings and emotions that are part of us when we are asked to step outside our comfort zones or do something differently. And affective states as a source of efficacy shaping information for teams, I think, includes things like feelings of optimism and feelings of collective flow. So 2 more important points, I think, around the notion of affective states. One is that there's 2 types. We could have negative affective states like anxiety, fear, and those are more enemies of efficacy. They're efficacy diminishing. But the positive affective states become efficacy enhancing. And those are feelings like optimism, hope, excitement, success. So those affective states inform people's judgments about what they're capable of accomplishing in the future. And the other important point I wanted to make about the affective states is that those feelings and emotions, the negative ones, the research on pandemics shows that negative affective states are heightened in the time of a pandemic. So when we consider, the notion of that source of efficacy as a way that people interpret what they're capable of doing during the time of COVID-19, I think the negative affective states are heightened, and that's one of the things that would put efficacy at risk.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Thanks, Jenny. I think that's really interesting, isn't it? And, because we're looking at post-COVID, not that we're through it yet, but COVID, and trying to identify the opportunities from that to an extent. And yet what you're saying potentially is that actually that might be more difficult in some ways because of the expectations we might have about actually wanting to go back the way potentially to normality. Would that be a summary of that?
I think so. Is it okay if I go ahead to presentation mode again?
Yeah, that'd be good. Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, I have something that might help to enhance the thinking around what I was just sharing. I'm going to just do this for a minute. I might come back to that. So there are 4 sources that influence both individuals and teams' beliefs, their efficacy beliefs. Now, people could think of this in terms of a student in our classroom or in an online environment. They could think of these sources operating for teachers, for leaders in our system, regardless of who we are and what it is we're doing. These are the sources that we draw on when we're thinking about what we're capable of accomplishing. The first is mastery experiences, and it's the most potent source of efficacy shaping information for individuals and teams because it's based on a first-hand experience. It's when we've set a goal and met with success, and we attribute or interpret that success through a growth mindset. We understand that our efforts made a difference, and as a result of seeing the impact, we come to believe that if we tried again, we'd likely succeed. That's the most potent source of efficacy shaping information. The second is vicarious experiences. It's when we see others who have similar challenges and opportunities meet with success, and we come to think, well, that if they did it, then surely we can do it too. There's 2 more sources, and I want people that are listening to think about the remote environment and how might we tap into these sources given the remote environment. And I have some ideas around that too, but I'm just wanting to put people's thinking around these are the sources, and during the time of COVID-19, what can we do to tap into these? The third source, if we have formal leaders on listening today, which I suspect is the majority of our audience, it's that social persuasion. It's when teams of teachers are convinced by a credible and trustworthy other that they have what it takes to succeed and to take risks. So the research shows that the more credible the source is that's trying to influence teachers, the more likely it will it'll shape their efficacy beliefs. And then that final source is, what Paul kind of made me think about. It's that idea of emotions. I've shared this graphic with other audiences, and I had an interesting comment from a principal recently. The idea is people are often sitting in the center of the circle in the comfort zone, and our job is to ensure that we put people in the stretch zone, our teachers, our students, because it's in the stretch zone that real learning occurs. And these are the affective states too, right? Some of these descriptors that you see here. Sometimes we push people a little too far into the danger zone. The comment that the principal made was, she said, I in the past felt I was operating from the comfort zone and trying to push people out to the stretch zone. But during the time of COVID-19, I feel I'm operating out in that outer circle, and that I'm just trying to move people in toward, more stretch and more comfort at this point in time. But that fourth source, those feelings and emotions, that's the emotional tone of the organization. And they're the least influential source of efficacy shaping information normally. But as I said, in the time of a pandemic, I think that they're much more elevated. And I'm sure the people that are listening could allude to that. Teachers' anxiety levels and stress are definitely elevated. I'll say one more thing and then I'll just come back. I'll stop sharing. But the important things are, if we are hoping to influence efficacy, I think this information is important and foundational, because we have to understand how efficacy beliefs are formed. And based on those sources from past experience, mastery experiences, vicarious experiences, feedback, and positive emotions, what people do is they weigh those in relation to how difficult is the task, or what is the magnitude of the challenge. And as a result, their future-oriented beliefs about what they're capable of accomplishing are formed. So collective efficacy is a future-oriented belief. And another important thing is it's situational specific. So if we may have felt a high sense of efficacy in our ability to engage students in a face-to-face environment, given the unique situation of remote learning, our efficacy might be diminished because we're faced with a situation that we're not so familiar with. So I'll stop there, because again, that's a lot of big ideas. I'll see if there's any questions from the audience or thoughts from you, David.
Yeah, I can see that Donald Patterson has put a comment in. I don't know if Donald would like to come forward and unmute and put his camera on. Hello, Donald.
Hi, David. Hi, Jenny.
Hi.
Thank you very much for speaking to us all. It's really interesting. I was commenting there in the chat that myself, I'm a local authority education officer, and myself and a colleague who's also on this call, Isabel Sinclair, we've been working on a document for our local authority around leadership development, and we put your concept of collective efficacy at the heart of that, because leadership at all levels is about collective efficacy. So the point I was making in the chat there was that the whole concept of teacher participation and empowerment is really important in your description of collective efficacy. And empowerment is a central agenda item for us in Scottish education. And I was wondering if you feel that the situation of the pandemic is affecting people's sense of empowerment in decision making. Is that what you're feeling is the case? And if so, what's the kind of, how do we counteract that? How do we guard against the damaging effects that might have in terms of us developing collective efficacy in our schools?
That's an excellent question. And so I think that it really depends, because I've talked to a lot of educators where they're still feeling a sense of empowerment and efficacy despite COVID-19. And then I've talked to a lot of people where the situation is very different. Where efficacy beliefs are established, once they're firmly established, they're pretty hard to break down. And so I think that, in places where there are damaging effects, perhaps it's because people didn't have necessarily a sense of efficacy to begin with. And so I think that that sense of empowerment, where people are feeling that they don't have a lot of autonomy or choice or around decision making, yeah, definitely puts their efficacy at further risk. I have some ideas, like part of the presentation I prepared goes into a model for leading collective efficacy. And Donald, you mentioned the teacher empowerment is part of that model. And so I don't know if it's a good time right now to jump to that model. I'm kind of thinking I definitely want to get there before our time is up, because I want to come back to the things that you've surfaced, some of these ideas, and then move to what leaders might do to empower teachers. But I'm pausing because I just wonder if there's any other questions around specific things in the environment that leaders might be doing right now, or if there's ideas out there from the audience members around how we can encourage teachers and empower teachers for remote learning or online teaching.
Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you. I'll come back to your question later for sure.
Thanks, Jenny. Are there any questions then on, based on what Jenny said there, about those ideas, or that anyone would like to come in?
I like that Yvonne said the stretch zone is Vygotsky's, so proximal development. Yeah. I see it the same.
Yvonne, would you like to come in?
Hi.
Hello, Yvonne.
I wasn't really going to elaborate on it. It was just as Jenny was speaking, I saw the same parallels as you've done, Jenny, that idea that you're going out with the comfort zone, and that together as a group, you can achieve more than you could individually. That kind of idea from Vygotsky.
And how have you used that, Yvonne? Have you used that are you in school, are you local authority? What's your setting? Sorry,
I should have introduced myself. Yeah, I'm Yvonne McBlain. I work for Falkirk Council as an education support officer. And kind of some of what Donald said resonated with me as well, because we're looking at empowerment and participation. So these words jumped out at me as soon as I saw Donald's chat. And I suppose what the work I've been doing recently is looking at how teacher agency, teacher self-efficacy, there's so many words, don't you think, that kind of mean the same thing? Mm-hmm. So autonomy, agency, efficacy. So looking at how building a sense of self-efficacy amongst teachers, a sense of autonomy and the staff within the school, and then trying to, by setting up that culture, trying to then extend that culture to pupils and to parents, so that you do genuinely get a sense of self-efficacy across the whole school and its community. So I've been working with some schools in our authority to see if we can develop that.
And how is that going so far, Yvonne? What kind of stage are you at? And have you got any kind of plans in terms of processes that you can maybe share? Because I see Donald's put in about maybe collaborating with you, because they're looking at similar areas.
Ah, sounds fascinating, yeah. We've really worked with about 3 schools and a couple of colleagues in my team. This was actually part of my university work, because Paul was saying there's a lot of studying going on here. So I was looking at the idea of participation and exactly how it could look. So we've worked with a couple of schools, and we've started from the idea of working with teachers to shape how they work with their pupils, to shape their curriculum. So it's the co-creation of the curriculum. That's the context that we're using. And we're using How Good Is Our School Toolkit as what I've called in my university work a mediator, a tool that enables a shared language to develop. So that idea, Jenny, that you spoke about, of the importance of the affective domain, the emotions. The other idea that's coming through for me is that how situated and how many factors can influence whether or not that sense of self-efficacy actually develops. I'm probably going into far too much detail and saying a lot more than you wanted me to say, but
No.
that's the kind of directions that the work is going in.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you very much for sharing it. Really interesting. And actually what you said at the very start of one about shared language and actually the amount of different words that we use to describe the same thing. So that shared language understanding is so important. Thank you very much for sharing that. And Donald's put his email address in there for some connection and collaboration, which is great.
Thank you. I'll take a note of that, Donald.
I see Jay Ward's also put a question coming in. I don't know if Jay Ward, I don't know your first name. Would you like to come in and just and put that question in?
Hi David, it's Jackie. How are you doing? I suppose it was your illustration there, Jenni, made me think about sort of that stretch zone, and that's where we're wanting people to be. And I suppose what I'm thinking is that because we're dealing with so many different new experiences, whether or not that stretch zone is just a wee bit smaller just now because we've got too many other things that are going on that are stretching us. So it's, or is it bigger because we've got so many different things going on? I'm not sure. I suppose it's just when we're working with staff, we need to remember there's only so much stretch before that danger bit comes in place.
Absolutely. And I'm in the chat pod that you made me think of, Jackie, and it's the concerns-based adoption model. And I'm not sure if people are familiar with that, and I don't have time right now to go into that, but you made me think of it in what you were saying. And the concerns-based adoption model is the work of Shirley Hord and Jean Hall and Hord. And it's based on 30 years of extensive research in schools about how people adjust to change. Mm-hmm. And their model has different elements. One element is the stages of concern, which deals with the emotional aspect of change. And they talk about the different stages that teachers go through. And when I've been talking about COVID-19, people are saying, oh yeah, these are the different stages that we've seen. And I'll just briefly give you the stages. The first stage of concern is unconcerned. And, it's because, either this too shall pass or this doesn't impact me at all. And that might have been where we were beginning of March. The next stage is informational. As we realize that this might affect us, we start to need information about what the change entails. The third stage is personal concerns. And that is really around how's this going to impact me personally? What's going to be required of change in my, what am I going to have to do? How much time is this going to be required? And then the next stage is management, and that's really around how am I going to manage this in my practice. Those stages are all task or self-related. There's 3 more stages. The next one is consequence, and that sounds like how is this change going to impact my students? The 6th is collaboration. How can I collaborate with my colleagues to make this even better? And the final stage is refocusing, and it's when people and teachers have felt a certain comfort level, they've gotten into the flow perhaps, and they're feeling a sense of ownership where they want to make the change even better. And those final 3 stages of concern are impact level concerns. And so the model says that we have to address teachers' concerns where they're at. And if we don't give them enough information early on, their personal concerns will be heightened. If we don't address personal concerns, it's really difficult to get to the management concerns. And if we don't address those, we won't get to the impact concerns. And so when we think about that emotional aspect of change, that model has helped, I think, frame people's thoughts. A lot of people are still in personal and management concerns. And as leaders, it's addressing those emotions in a way that will get them comfortable to be able to start thinking about impact.
Thank you. That was really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, excellent.
Thanks, Jackie.
Put a link there too to a website where people can find out more about the work of Hall and Hord, this CBAM model. That's
great. Thank you. And before we maybe move on to the next part of the presentation, Jenni, maybe just bring in James Kerr, who put in a comment. So I don't know if James wants to come forward and unmute and put his video on. James, hi.
Hi there, I'm James Cameron, a head teacher in Glasgow, and I really appreciate a lot of the work that you've been doing, Jenny, and also this conversation, because myself and the management team have been very concerned about how we are moving forward and the relationships, etc., and the work that we have done about efficacy across the school, because just from practical reasons, we've got things like teachers in 2 different staff rooms now, not coming together, collegiates meeting, meetings are kind of in groups, and it's all kind of separate. And we're looking very much at how we try and keep everyone together and that kind of feeling of togetherness. But one of the things that I wrote on there in my comment, we do feel a bit like an island because we're not really going out. We are maybe remotely and, talking to people, etc. But one of the things that really has happened is that it kind of, our fear of pulling all the relationships apart, it kind of pulled us together, because we know that we need each other even more. And we have, I think, the bit about you said about, having strong efficacy. If strong efficacy is there, it's really hard to break it. And I think that's what we're finding just now. This is a really difficult time, but people are pulling together rather than pulling apart. And I'm heartened by that, but I'm still very conscious of it. And a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about today, and that paper that you just sent, I think will be really useful in going forward.
Excellent. So you've just reinforced. Oh, thank you. You just reinforced some of the things that I've heard from others as well. That notion of, even though we might be physically separated, we need each other more so now than ever before. And so people are collaborating in ways that they hadn't. And I think part of it is because COVID-19 has really promoted an environment that legitimizes help seeking. And, in the past, people might have had that imposter syndrome. That's a phrase used by my colleague, Stephen Katz. It's that he calls it that inner voice, that whispers inside our heads that people are going to find out I don't belong if I ask the wrong question. But during this time, I think any question's fair game, and people are feeling that sense of legitimacy around seeking help when needed. And so that is promising, and that is great. And I love that you're very conscious of it and concerned about it, because I think that if we don't continue to ensure teachers have opportunities to engage in meaningful collaboration, even in an online environment, that we're going to separate them, and there's going to be a bunch of islands, to use your metaphor. And there's ways to do that, right? Like, I think that observation in an online environment is probably less difficult logistically than it is in a face-to-face environment. And I haven't come across any instances yet where that's happening, but it's definitely possible, where people can kind of peek into those virtual classrooms and share tips and tricks and problem solve together about what's working based on common concerns that they have, whether it be engaging students or it might even be at a technical level, simple things, and I shouldn't say simple things, but technical things such as uploading rubrics or providing students with meaningful feedback and those sort of things.
Yeah, we're definitely going to be moving towards that. One of the very simple things we're doing just now is extending playtime a couple of times a week and encouraging that the teachers are going out into the playground. And one of the reasons for that is for them to talk to each other, as well as be interacting with children, just to have that social interaction, because it's really important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, James. Actually, I see that Janice has put a comment in as well about, James, you're an island in a sea of islands. So I think that what you've just described, James, is probably feeling across many different school leaders feeling exactly the same thing as well. And Annette put in about that kind of important sense of common purposes as well. Jenni, would you like to move on to maybe pick up another couple of bits and pieces? It's been really good conversation, and I know that will continue as we go through. So I don't know if you want to pick up the next section and then see what else we can pick up from participants.
Sure. I have two more things that I wanted to share, and I think I can get them both in, and I think we could do them justice given the remaining time together. So in my head, I was thinking, do I want to move on to the leadership practices at this point? Or do I want to step back? Because I don't know if you noticed, I kind of skipped some slides at the beginning. And because I think we have enough time, I'm going to kind of take a step back.
Okay.
Because I think what I want to share is a matrix that will engage some deeper conversation. And I think it will also address one of the questions that was posed earlier on through email or however you gathered it. But it was the question somebody asked is, how do you ensure that more reluctant members of the staff are on board with the team?
Yep.
So I'm going to just kind of come back to my PowerPoint for a moment. And I'm going to backtrack to the stuff that I skipped here at the beginning. So this is a matrix that Stephanie Height and I, in our new book, which is coming out in the next 6 weeks, I think, it's called Leading Collective Efficacy. And it's about powerful stories of achievement and equity. And we think the timing's good because, you know, we understand now, like, there's a greater awareness around collective efficacy, that it exists and its importance. But leaders are now asking, are there examples in schools where teams or entire faculties have been able to realize achievement? We know through some empirical research, but what are some of the stories, case studies that might resonate with people? And so in thinking about that and thinking about the power of efficacy in closing equity, achievement gaps, I should say in addressing inequity, each one of the stories in the chapters in the book talk about how people have been able to achieve that. But this matrix kind of looks at, on one side you'll see there the strength of efficacy beliefs, and the matrix is showing the receptiveness of individuals or groups to change during stages of implementation and how that's related over time to the strength of efficacy beliefs. So when that person asked that question about the reluctant staff members, we've all probably experienced that, you know, when being asked to do something differently, if efficacy is low, people will often be dismissive and evasive. They might think this too shall pass. And it's because they don't believe they have the skills or the capability to do what they're being asked to do. And so you can see that would be a natural reaction. And over time, we've probably all worked with some groups or individuals where when they realize the change isn't going away, they become unreceptive and or even combative. And again, I think that's closely related to their lack of efficacy. If they don't believe their efforts are going to amount to much, they, you know, look toward this maintaining the status quo and are reluctant to change because their efficacy is lacking. But if we think of the relationship between a high sense of efficacy, and I'm sure you've all worked with teachers that are inquisitive when something, you know, when they're being asked to do something different, or you know, when all of a sudden a change is thrust upon them, like what this COVID-19 has caused. But we have more of an adaptive capacity to deal with those changes. And over time, we become proactive and innovative. And so I just wanted to share this matrix and this thinking and perhaps ask the audience, you know, if we look at that, of course, ideally, we want to be in that upper quadrant because that's where we realize impact. And I go back to those impact concerns from the concerns-based adoption model. What does this mean for my students? How can I capitalize on the things that I'm being asked to do so that I ensure that my students, the outcomes for my students are positive? And then, of course, those collaboration-related concerns as well. So just thoughts about that matrix, some of the things that you've experienced. And I just want to make a couple comments too, because when that question was asked, I wrote a note, you know, how do we get those more reluctant members on board? In order for efficacy to be enhanced, people need to succeed at the things that they think they're not capable of accomplishing. So we need to ensure that we set teachers up to have success early on, and that they need to recognize that it was their efforts that resulted in positive outcomes. People don't always make the link between their efforts. That's that interpreting it through a growth mindset. And I read a quote from Michael Fullan. Many of Fullan quotes resonate with me, and Andy Hargraves. This one was from Fullan in his 6 Secrets of Change. And he said, sometimes you have to give respect before it's been earned. And that resonated with me because when I've given that advice to other leaders in the field, it's changed relationships between, you know, them and their teachers. So I've said a lot again. I'll just pause and ask you, David, if you have questions, or the audience if they have thoughts, or if that matrix resonates with them, and then we'll reserve the rest of the time to get into the framework.
Yeah, great. But I really like the matrix, Jenni, and I think it makes perfect sense. And I think seeing something laid out in that way makes you automatically think about examples of when you've been involved in situations like, oh, maybe that's the reason why that was the case. And I suppose what you were talking about the skills and the competency, there's also that element, I suppose, of change weary, and seeing surface level change after change after change, nothing really happening at the bottom of the sea kind of chain. It's that, you know, the seabed still stays the same, and people maybe get weary of seeing changes, and so understandably might be reluctant to really engage and put effort into something if they think it's just another thing. So I suppose, are there any questions or comments from participants that'd like to come in based on Jenni's input there? Not so far. Okay. And so in terms of Jenni, and are you looking at case studies to, I suppose, to support that, so that people can see examples of strategies that leaders have taken to take forward change and counter that? Because I suppose it comes back to that empowerment agenda about, if people own and take ownership for that change and responsibility for it, they're more likely to be engaged in it. What would be the starting point then from your, in terms of those case studies or examples you've seen? What has been the starting point in different situations to really empower staff to take on those changes?
So in the book, we do share those stories, real stories based on real leaders, teacher leaders in some cases, and formal leaders in some. And the book's organized around the enabling conditions, and one of those is empowering teachers. And so maybe this would be a good time to just kind of go back to my slides and share a little bit more around those enabling conditions. So I'm going to jump ahead, and I'm going to get to those right here. This is a model for leading collective efficacy. And so I'll just kind of, sometimes when I'm doing a webinar, I'll ask people to put in the chat pod, based on what they see here, things that they might infer about the model. I'm not sure, I can't see the chat pod while I'm sharing my screen, but if people want to do that, because it might get people thinking. You'll notice collective teacher efficacy, of course, in the center, and then the circle that's directly around that are those sources that I referred to earlier, the 4 sources that shape people's beliefs and groups' beliefs about what they're capable of accomplishing: mastery experiences, vicarious experiences, social persuasion, and affective states. And then these other things you see, you notice, of course, people, if they are chatting in the pod, usually people will say that supportive leadership is envelops the entire model. And then there's 4 other enabling conditions, including the empowerment that we've been talking about, cohesive teacher knowledge, goal consensus, and embedded reflective practices. Now, what's important, I think, for people to understand is that this model is based on what we know from research. We know there is a clear and strong relationship between teacher leadership and collective efficacy. Some studies show that collective efficacy, or they assume collective efficacy is the precursor, and that the consequence is teacher leadership, while others assume the antecedent is teacher leadership, and that it results in collective efficacy. I think it's probably safe to say that it's bidirectional, but we know there is a clear and strong relationship between teacher leadership and collective efficacy, and hence that enabling condition, empowering teachers. In cohesive teacher knowledge, again, based on what we know about the antecedents of collective efficacy in schools, we know that where teachers have more intimate knowledge about each other's work, and where teachers agree about what constitutes effective pedagogy, sound instruction and assessment. That cohesiveness leads to a greater sense of efficacy. Another enabling condition is consensus on goals, known through research. And then the final one is embedded reflective practices. Now, I'm going to go a little bit more into these, but one of my frustrations is that there are a lot of claims about how to enhance efficacy and sometimes everything under the sun, right? And I've heard Professor Hattie say that it's not as simple as just making teachers feel good about themselves. And I've seen lots of posts on Twitter about community building and hashtag what a great way to build efficacy. And while I believe that laughter and community building is important, it is more complicated than that. And so what is important to me is turning to what we know through research and not just making those claims that aren't based on evidence. And so that model is based on what we know. And then what I have left in the presentation too are some specific leadership practices for each one of those. So I'll just pause and see, and then we can move on to that when people are ready.
That's great. I think we've got Robert's put a couple of comments in. I don't know if Robert would like to come in around the difficulty when there's been pushback. So Robert, I don't know if you'd like to unmute and come in.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Robert.
Hiya. Hello, nice to thank you very much for Jenny coming along. Yeah, it's just an observation. Obviously, I'm quite new into the headship of the schools I'm at, relatively, and you come with all ambition and and you want to move the school, but you find over that sort of initial consultation that there's teaching staff, it goes back years of sort of pushback and denial, and perhaps it becomes wary for the people who've led them before, and they're sort of, instead of collaborating, it becomes a case where we're just going to bypass you and carry on with the people who are a little bit more willing. My concern is in a small school, when that one teacher has so much influence over a significant number of children, and they're therefore their parents and the community, it doesn't feel good, but it's a very wary battle. I don't want to use the word battle, but it does sometimes feel a little bit like that. And on top of that, we've got the pressures of COVID and moving everyone on in that respect. It's a difficult one. It's just an observation. And I am a positive person, Jenny, and I've got all those qualities in abundance, I think. But it's an inherited problem, which goes back 20, 30 years, I suspect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you make me think of the importance of self-care for leaders at this time, as well as ensuring that you maintain a sense of your own efficacy, both individually and collectively, to be able to lead this difficult adaptive work. Somebody asked me once for a playbook almost, of how to enhance efficacy. And I don't think a playbook exists because it's so contextual and it's so adaptive in nature that with an adaptive challenge, there is no clear-cut step-by-step approach. But what we can do is turn to the research, try things in our practice based on what we think is our theory of action, come back, reflect, did what we think would happen based on the practice that we put in place actually result in what we had hoped? If not, what we do differently? If so, why? So it's just staying the course and again, just working toward helping teachers really understand the incredible influence that they have when they have that belief. And then I worry about those teachers in groups that don't feel a sense of efficaciousness, because isn't that a sad place to be? If you don't think what you're doing matters, I just can't imagine how you'd have the optimism or desire to come to work every day. So it is such an important thing that we continue to figure out together. Technical challenges, there's a clear-cut answer, but for this adaptive work, the people with the problem have to do the work of solving it, you know. And so maybe this might be a good time to turn to some of those leadership practices.
Yeah, and I suppose, Jenny, some of the protocols in your book as well support that in terms of those approaches to take and that inclusive. And I suppose what I like about those protocols is there's not really a hiding place, and it brings things out, because actually that's a challenge, isn't it? About sometimes it's easy to just be dismissive. And actually Andrew had asked that question about, can you not be inquisitive and dismissive? So I don't know if Andrew wants to come in and just expand on that as well in terms of that kind of question, because I think that maybe ties in with yours as well, Robert.
Hello.
Andrew, hi.
Hi. Well, yeah, you know, the model that you've got there, what was it, the receptiveness to change, it kind of seems like it's a flow, but I think there's, you know, you can be both at the same time. You know, you can be really inquisitive about something that's going on and want to find out about it, but, you know, I suppose you might develop a negative attitude to it at the same time. So that doesn't mean that you're necessarily change resistant. I suppose it's maybe that you've probably looked at something and valued something else more than that whatever change was being proposed. So I think there's probably room for having, you know, both sets of views at the same time, rather than just I'm not suggesting you think that, but the model kind of leads to that kind of way of thinking, doesn't it? That was it. It was just a comment, but yeah.
Thanks. Thank you, Andrew.
You're making me think of, people can be inquisitive and skeptical at the same time when they might not be aware of the strength of the evidence, you know, and you made me think of the notion of implementation. We know that there's certain evidence-based practices that are supposed to work in education. We don't need any more research around what's supposed to work. We need to find ways to implement that research meaningfully in our practice, given our unique contexts. And there's research that shows why quality implementation fails in the healthcare system. And in healthcare, they study through implementation science the uptake of whether it be a procedure or implementation of a drug. And they follow the implementation to see how it becomes regularly or routine use in the healthcare profession. And what the research shows is it can take up to 17 years for something that has been known in clinical practice to be effective before it becomes routine use. For example, there was a study that looked at a clot-busting drug. They said it was demonstrated in a laboratory to be an effective blood thinner, but it took 15 years before it was regularly administered to heart attack victims. There's research that shows why quality implementation fails in the healthcare system, and I think for me, we could substitute healthcare for education. One reason is people are not aware of the strength of the evidence. And Andrew, when you were talking, you made me think of that, because they might be inquisitive, but they might be skeptical. Other reasons why quality implementation fails in the healthcare system is because people might not have time to learn about it. They might, of course, that's true in education. They might not be trained in certain procedures. And I think to my work with trying to get content area teachers to integrate literacy instruction in their content areas. But for me, the big one is not aware of the strength of the evidence, or they might philosophically agree with what it is they're being asked to do. So our work is to really understand the root, I think, of the resistance and try to leverage our influence based on really knowing why people are resistant to change.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. And I'm just going to invite Patricia Watson, if Patricia would like to come in and unmute and put her video on. She's put a comment in the chat pane.
Thanks, David. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, I'm thinking a lot of things here as listening to Jenny, and she's obviously moved the conversation on since I put that comment in the chat pane. But I think it's really important for all of us as leaders to be really thinking about how we walk alongside staff and just moving that on and thinking about what you just said, Jenny, about how do we ensure, or anything around how do we intervene as leaders to make sure that that skepticism and inquisitiveness doesn't become cynicism, and the danger of that. So I wondered if you had anything around that, about what, how do we intervene and make sure that we actually keep staff on board so that we can gradually nudge them towards those changes and out of their comfort zone through giving that appropriate level of challenge that doesn't scare them and make them run off, run into that cynicism box, if you like.
So in the lens of collective efficacy, what you've made me think of is coming back. I want to come back to the 4 sources, because I think that those are places we can go. Ensuring that teachers have success, small wins, and helping them understand and set goals, so but also understand the link between their efforts and resulting student outcomes. But those opportunities for teachers to meet with success firsthand, see others meet with success, make sure that we share those success stories. The social persuasion aspect as leaders, helping teachers to understand how remote teaching and learning is similar and or different from face-to-face, and then helping reassure them that they have the skills, they have the expertise, they have the education to understand effective pedagogy. And so how does it look a little bit different online, but providing them with that feedback and in a way that you're reassuring them around their skills and their experiences and expertise. And then ensuring that the affective states remain positive, addressing the concerns around where they're at. I want to jump to, because I'm worried around our time, and I think perhaps this is kind of in further the conversation. Those enabling conditions, empowered teachers. What I did was I looked to the Ontario Leadership Framework. In Ontario, it's the framework that guides principles. It's based on 5 categories, but it articulates different leadership moves that principals can employ. And I've been examining it in relation to these enabling conditions, and I've just pulled out some of the leadership practices that are articulated in that framework that I felt fit under each one of these. So when we think about empowering teachers, we want to involve staff in the design and implementation of important decisions, because that's what empowerment really means, is giving teachers autonomy and decision-making power over things that are important related to school improvement, providing them with leadership opportunities and supporting them as they take those on, and conveying high expectations about what teachers can accomplish. If we think of the enabling condition of cohesive teacher knowledge, I think it's important to actively oversee the instructional program, facilitate those opportunities for staff to learn from another, provide opportunities and supports that support teachers in working together. Of course, David mentioned protocols. Some are located in the book, and you can find a number of really rich protocols online for engaging teachers in professional learning and ensuring for equal voice and ensuring that people have opportunities to identify biases and assumptions. The goal consensus is very important. So finding ways to facilitate teachers' engagement in processes for identifying and owning specific goals and building consensus, and encouraging staff regularly to evaluate their progress toward achieving those goals. And finally, the notion of embedded reflective practices, ensuring that teachers have times to engage in structures that allow them to problem solve, where they're identifying some of their problems or dilemmas of practice related to student learning, and they're engaged in a cycle of inquiry where they're trying things in their practice and coming together to see, did it make an impact? You can always lead discussions about the merits of current and alternative practices, and challenge staff to continually re-examine the extent to which their practices are supporting the learning of all students. I want to back up because I just want to make one more point. It's this notion that, and this is John Hattie's voice in my head, I've had opportunities to collaborate with John, to write with John, to present with John, and he's always talking about the principals have the power to change the narrative in schools. And that really resonates with me. But I think it's not only the principals, I think everybody has the power to change the narrative. And we need to shift those conversations to ensure that we're having teachers focus on not what can't be done, but what can be done, ensuring a culture of high expectations and growth mindsets, and shifting the conversations to teaching, from teaching to learning, and that attribution for success and failure, that there's things that are definitely within our control, that we can, even in, in the midst of COVID-19, there's a lot that's within our control. And of course, talking about impact, our collective impact is going to be really critical moving forward. And so I'll just pause there because, again, I've done a lot of talking and I'll provide opportunities. Jennifer's asking if the presentation can be sent. I can definitely send it to Annette when we're finished today, and Annette can feel free to distribute that if that's the way, Annette, that you might go about doing that. Is that good?
Yes, thanks, Jenny. I'm trying to come back in at the moment. My camera doesn't seem to be working, but David, it looks as though David's been kicked out of the meeting. So we'll wait for him to come back. But yes, I'll distribute the PowerPoint out to people. That would be really helpful. I was particularly interested in your last point about how leaders can involve staff in different ways. And I think that whole picture, oh, thank you, Patricia, because I can't see me. I think that whole picture of supporting teachers to see their own skills and their own abilities where they don't see them themselves. So just a little, for instance, I once had a teacher who was quite challenging in her behaviours in school and in staff meetings. And actually, she wasn't involved in any of the staff decision-making processes. She wasn't seen to be a good teacher. She was seen to be a wee bit lazy and grumpy. And that didn't help her at all. But actually, she was quite talented in some areas of the curriculum. So by privileging that particular skill, it built up her confidence and actually allowed her to feel as though she was part of the team and had something to lead. And that made a huge difference across the staff, because people were thinking, well, do you know, if there's something good that she can offer to the school, surely I can too. And it built a much better sense of everybody's worth. And I think that's what collective efficacy is about too. It's that notion that people have worth, have value, and are very much part of that shared whole picture of what makes a good school. So thank you for all of those points.
I think that you're right. People feel like a valued and contributing member of the team. And as you were sharing that story, I had written down a note too that you just reminded me about. I was thinking of myself as a student in high school, and I was very not engaged at all. I was often dismissed from class for problem behavior. I had no interest in some of the classes. Wasn't true, of course, across all my classes where teachers were engaging. I think that, I was, but I'm thinking about one particular teacher who turned that around, and she did exactly what you're describing. She found a skill and an interest of mine. She allowed me some autonomy and put some trust in me, although I didn't deserve it. And she let me see my worth by giving me special projects. And I felt special, and it turned our relationship around. So as you were talking about that teacher, it reminded me of how teachers do that with students, right? In different ways. And so for that.
Yeah, everybody wants to feel that they've got something to contribute and that there's something that they're good at and that it's recognized. And that makes such a difference. And thankfully, I see David's back in now.
I'm back. Sorry about that.
Welcome back, David.
Thank you. So apologies, just missed that last bit there. I was actually going to suggest we bring in Barry Smith, who'd asked a question about, he was interested in the theory of action and how it might be done practically as part of the school improvement cycle. I know you've covered off a lot of that, Jenni, but I wonder if Barry maybe wanted to come in and just see if there was anything else he wanted to ask following the input so far. Barry, I don't know if you're there, if you want to come in and unmute and put your camera on. I see Barry is here, but I'm not seeing him come forward at the moment.
I wonder.
Okay, we'll leave that. Oh, Barry's trying to unmute. Here he is. Yeah. Barry, do we have you? Whilst Barry's doing that, we'll just get, are there any other questions or queries from anyone else in the session? Barry, it's not working. Sorry, Barry says it's not working, his microphone. So was there anything, Barry, else you wanted to pick up, if you want to type it in from the question? And whilst Barry's doing that, was there anything else that anyone wanted to pick up or ask Jenni? I mean, we've got a great opportunity here. Jenni's given up her time and, you know, really an opportunity to ask, which we don't always get these chances. There's actually a question from Roberta Porter. Sorry, was that Patricia coming in?
It was, but go on with Roberta's question first.
No, it's fine, Patricia. On you go. I can bring Roberta's question in after.
I just wondered from all of this that Jenni's been talking about today, what goes through my head is what are the implications for teacher education, for initial teacher education, for young people coming into the profession, and how do we influence their ways of thinking from the very onset of their career?
So I think, I didn't know if you were looking at me to answer that, but I think there's definitely a lot of implications around teacher education, you know, especially when teachers are so new. I remember my first few years, you know, my colleagues, I'd spend all my hours in my classroom. My colleagues would drag me to the staff room just so I could bond with them, and that was so helpful. But I think for teacher education, it's critically important to build efficacy, because the earlier it's established, the better, because if it's established early in a teacher's career, it's likely to be maintained over the course of his or her career. And so I wonder about teacher education programs and how, and ongoing, not just the initial education program, but professional learning. How can we ensure that we purposefully tap into those sources of efficacy as a characteristic of high quality professional learning? I think is really important.
Yeah, and that's a really good question, and a really good point, Jenni, because in Scotland at the moment, so, and it'll be similar, I'm sure, across the world, but we have the probationer system where after qualifying as a graduating from initial teacher education, those teachers go into school and they don't teach full time. I think it's about 0.75, 0.7 of a timetable. So they get additional time and to engage in professional learning and just kind of preparation for that kind of newly qualified role when they come out of probation. But of course, when schools closed to pupils in March time with lockdown, there was those probationers have lost that full term of really kind of continuing to develop their craft and knowledge and skills. And so they're now in schools full time, having missed that kind of term. So the Scottish Government are looking at this. So there's a package of support being developed, and Steph, who's on the call here, and Leslie Walker and Louise Sanders, so part of the team are working with General Teaching Council of Scotland to develop a package called Stepping Stones to support those post-probation teachers. And I suppose actually that's something that you're talking about, that we've asked, there's been the first blether we had with the participants last week, to identify, well, actually, what supports would be useful now. What would they look for? But I think actually there's maybe something around that in terms of what is their understanding of collective efficacy that might be a really helpful starting point for them to consider that and think about in which way are they efficacious in their classroom, and what are their what can they do to move that forward. So just when you were saying that, I'm just thinking of how that might impact in Scotland in terms of stepping stones. And Steph's put in information on stepping stones in the chat pane there. So there wasn't really a question on my bit there, Jenni, just highlighting what you've talked about on Patricia's point about that kind of post probation. Annette is wondering, Jenni, if you'd maybe say a little about that ladder of teacher involvement. I don't know if that was covered earlier when I was kicked out, but the ladder of involvement in school, which I love, you know, from first rung, I can't remember, is it 12 rungs or 10 rungs, but just those different levels of engagement and that kind of surface level, which actually really doesn't do much to that deep kind of learning. So is there anything you'd like to pick up around that?
Sure. So the ladder of teacher involvement, really, the reason I thought that was important to include was to create a common understanding about what we really mean by that. It's kind of that same conversation around expectations. When we say we have high expectations, some people interpret that one way and others interpret it another. And in my experience with some principals, when we talk about teacher voice, I think that they had different ideas about what that really means. The ladder that you see in the book was actually first conceived thinking about student voice and initiative in school improvement planning, and it came from Roger Hart. And it was first on my radar years ago because in the district where I was working, it was the big thing. We're going to work on student voice. And what happened was many teachers during their professional learning or collaboration time, they either found a questionnaire or created one, put it out to the student body, collected the student voice, analyzed it. I'm talking hours of work. Took what the students said, brought some recommendations forward to the principal. And I remember sitting in a principal's office. He had a red pen and a clipboard, and there were 10 recommendations coming forth, and he scratched out each one of them. Can't do this, can't do that. And I remember thinking, why did you bother asking? And why did you let the teachers spend so much time doing this? So I came across that ladder where student voice and autonomy was conceived. So if you substitute where you see teacher, it said student, and it helped us here in Ontario have a better understanding about what we mean. It's not tokenism, it's not the things at the bottom of the rung, but it's really involving students in meaningful ways, and each rung, as you know, gets more meaningful. And so because my work is with teachers, when I saw the ladder, I thought, well, I could modify it and help, paint a picture of what meaningful teacher involvement looks like. And when I've seen principals embrace allowing teams to have some of that decision-making power, and I'm not talking entirely because, ultimately the buck stops with the formal leaders, but when allowing teachers some decision-making power, how powerful it can be when we're talking about school improvement. I want to go to another one of my favorite quotes from Hargraves and Fullen. They say in Professional Capital, successful and sustainable school improvement can't be done to or even for teachers. It can only be accomplished by and with them. And that's really the heart of my work and what I believe. So that ladder to me mattered because I kept seeing instances where teachers were being held to the non-degree of participation. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually in Education Scotland had a session about collaboration and what it means in different forms of collaboration, and it was sparked by we talked about the Education Scotland boat. It was sparked by Gillian Hamilton, who talked about pupil voice and pupil feedback, and they discussed and shared their experience of collaboration. Sometimes is like having a new boat built for you and designed and then brought on and asked, what colour do you want the deck? So that kind of actually, what is the point of asking that question? So just exactly what you've kind of described there. So I'm wary of time, and there was two things I was going to pick up, and one is Barry is now in. Barry, did you manage to unmute? Would you like to come in? We've got a couple of minutes. We'll come to Barry, and I've got one last question I'd like just to ask Jenni, if that's possible.
Hi, David. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, Barry, we can, yeah.
So I guess, first of all, apologies for that novice attempt earlier on. Clearly the technology is better than I am. So just moving on swiftly from that poor start, the question I was wanting to ask Jenni was around the model that is the theory of action around fostering collective efficacy. And it's noted as a propeller with 4 aspects: creating opportunities, establishing goals and expectations, empowerment, and helping interpret results. And I haven't remembered that. I do have it in front of me, so I'm not pretending that I'm very, very clever. So my question is, Jenni, the aspect of empowering teachers, I think that, what I'm trying to understand is how that can come before, for example, creating meaningful opportunities for collaboration, because I guess teachers, in my experience, have to feel that sense of empowerment, and so therefore creating those opportunities in some respects has to come first. So I'm just really asking you to say a wee bit more about that whole notion of it being a type of propeller.
Well, the notion of the propeller really came to me from an author. His name is Jervis Bush, and he's out of Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. I did a lot of reading around theory of action, and it's something that I think is really important for us to understand leading school improvement. And so in his book is called, Clear Leadership, one of my favorite books. Now, he writes from a business perspective, but there's lots of parallels, and a lot will resonate with educators, but his book is Clear Leadership. And he talks about a theory of action being like a propeller spinning, because each idea does impact the other. Now, Barry, when you first couldn't unmute, I'm going to come back to the propeller idea, but I wanted to not forget to mention, I put the links to Vivienne Robinson's book, Reduce Change to Increase Improvement. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but she gets deep into theory of action. The bypass approach someone mentioned earlier, I wondered if they were familiar with her work, because she talks about that, the engagement versus bypass approach. But that book, I think, really is a complement to the ideas that we've been talking about. And if anyone hasn't seen it, I really highly recommend you go to that. I want to touch on the providing meaningful opportunities for collaboration. Roger Goddard, who's one of the leading researchers of collective efficacy out of Ohio State University, shows that in an empirical study that the formal leaders, he's trying to find the link between leadership practices and increased student outcomes. And they often look for indirect links because they can't find a direct link between the formal leader and increased student outcomes. What he showed in a research study was that the leaders in the building can directly predict the degree to which teachers come together to collaborate. And when that collaboration is focused on instructional improvement, it directly predicted collective efficacy, which directly predicted student achievement. So those links are really important. And I agree that we need to provide teachers with opportunities to collaborate in order for them to feel a sense of empowerment. But I think individually, we also need to make sure that we're tapping into individual teacher expertise and helping teachers individually feel empowered so that they can bring that back to the collective. I don't know if that answered your question. You got me thinking I need to think more about that propeller, the spinning propeller. But I liked the idea because it came from Jervis Bush, and again, he talks in Clear Leadership about the importance of figuring out our theories of action.
Okay, Jenni, that was
great.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And before we wrap up, I was just going to ask Jenni one last question, and I really just and it's probably difficult to answer, but I suppose it comes back to head teachers in terms of we're talking about collective efficacy, and I just wondered about that question from Roberta, who asked, how do we build resilience in our own efficacy during times of immense pressure? I know that's a really difficult question to answer in milliseconds. However, any thoughts you've got around that, I think head teachers would be appreciated from them.
Well, you know what I encourage people to do is think back to the framework where we have the sources of efficacy, and think of your own efficacy and how you might be very cognizant of the 4 sources, relying on each other as well. Like you could make sure that you collaborate with your colleagues, make sure you're recognizing mastery experiences and taking opportunities to learn vicariously, and you know, ensuring that you have somebody, a colleague, a trusted, credible other that's giving you that feedback. Just be vulnerable and try to stay positive. So coming back to that framework and just applying it to your own leadership practice, I guess is where I'm going. The other thing I'm very aware of that during our time, I talk a lot with my hands. I don't know if that's
all right.
I don't have myself on the screen, but I know I've done a lot of talking with my hands. So if anyone found that distracting, I apologize.
I really wouldn't worry about that. Thank you very much, Jenni.